Hey guys, before we begin, a brief content warning. This episode discusses suicide and mental health struggles. If you're struggling, please know that you're not alone and help is available. Anywhere in Canada, you can call or text 988 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Stay safe, guys. We've included additional resources in the show notes.
Imagine sitting in a doctor's office. Your two children are sick with diphtheria, a horrible bacterial infection. As it grows, the bacteria releases a toxin that kills tissue in the nose and throat, forming a leathery gray membrane. If it becomes thick enough, that membrane can block the entire windpipe, asphyxiating the patient and giving the disease its nickname as the silent strangler. Diphtheria is common in Toronto, spread by airborne droplets and objects contaminated with the bacteria. The good news is that an antitoxin exists. It has flaws, but it can counteract the effect of the bacteria. The problem is that it's extremely expensive. Up to $80 for a course of treatment, several weeks' wages for many families. It is not produced in Canada, and in one of those acts of buffoonery that boggles the mind, the federal government has imposed a 50% tariff on all imported serums. You have two sick children, and you only have enough money to purchase one course of treatment. So one child will live, and the other may die. This scenario was described by a Toronto physician at the turn of the 20th century. However, within a few decades, the number of people dying from diphtheria would plummet, and Toronto would become a world leader in public health, producing vaccines for diphtheria and a host of other diseases. Today's episode is about John Gerald FitzGerald and how he made it happen.
Adam, you told me this episode was about a public health reformer, but it seems it has a dark undercurrent.
Yeah, unfortunately, Dr. FitzGerald had some private demons, and he lived in a society that treated mental illness as something shameful to be concealed.
So, he saved millions of people from these horrible diseases, but in the end, he couldn't save himself.
Exactly. That's why we have the proverb, physician, heal thyself. We're here to tell the story of this man's public triumphs and private tragedies. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller, and this is Muddy York.
Is Muddy York. This episode will include numerous audio clips from a pair of interviews that we conducted with James FitzGerald. He's the grandson of this week's subject and author of the book, What Disturbs Our Blood. Here he describes what he was told about his family's history as he grew up and what prompted him to try and learn more.
I grew up in Deer Park in Toronto on Balmoral Avenue in my grandfather's house that he built in 1914. It was this very Gothic house that my father had grown up in the 1920s. And so it was a kind of a repeat childhood experience, very cold British upbringing, my brother, sister, and I. And there was never a mention of my grandfather growing up. My mother would tell me a story later that when I was 5, I walked out of my kindergarten class solemnly up to her bedroom and said, I want to change my name from Jamie to Gerry, which startled her enormously because we never spoke about my grandfather. But children are like that. They sort of pick up the unspoken. My father, Jack, my grandfather's son, was also an eminent doctor. And he taught at the University of Toronto clinical immunology, had his own allergy extract lab, and his star was rising in the 50s and 60s. And then, so we're living in privilege, but at the same time, I'm watching this horror story unfold where my father, in front of my eyes in the 60s when I'm a teenager, starts to unravel and have a nervous breakdown in sort of in front of our eyes. And he made 2 suicide attempts when I was in my late teens. And these were kind of kept quiet My sister saved his life for the second time by injection of morphine, so it was really horrifying. And that's when I started to question. At this point, I was at university, and why all of this silence? And I think it's what made me a journalist and a writer and a historian. I needed to know. And I think when I was around 19 or so, I asked my mother point blank to try to figure out my father's suicidality. I mean, he recovered, but he never really recovered after that. And recovered, he didn't die, but he was on lithium the rest of his life and alone in a one-bedroom apartment. So it was a really sad end for my father. So I just asked my mother point blank, what's the story with my grandfather? Did he kill himself? And she just looked at me and nodded, and that was sort of it.
John Gerald FitzGerald, commonly known as Gerry, was born on December 9, 1882, in the town of Drayton, Ontario. This was 9 months and 1 week after his parents' wedding, so I guess they enjoyed their wedding night. At the age of 9, his family moved to nearby Harriston. Both of these towns can be found in Wellington County, northwest of Guelph. Gerry's father was a pharmacist who owned the town drugstore. He was described as a good provider and a strict disciplinarian. Gerry's mother would become something of an invalid as he was growing up.
Here she is, marrying a pharmacist, she's from Toronto originally, and going up to this small town and has 4 children, and she's very bright and is in those days, pre-feminist days, we're not really allowed to work except being as a teacher or a librarian or something. And as far as I know, she didn't work. So she becomes an invalid, and it's not clear what kind of invalidism, but there's a sense that she got depressed. And so that's sort of my, if you like, dime store Freudian interpretation of what motivated my teenage grandfather, who's brilliant in medical school at 16, he had a kind of a savior complex. I'm going to do something about this.
Gerry worked in his father's shop after school, using a mortar and pestle to prepare many of the drugs that his father sold, often delivering them to customers on horseback. He would also use this time to study his father's medical books. This would pay off in 1899 when he was admitted to U of T Medical School at the age of 16, making him the youngest student in the history of the school. One of the big focuses of his education would have been what is then called bacteriology. Over the past few decades, doctors had identified the bacteria that cause diseases like anthrax, TB, and cholera, and crude vaccines or antitoxins were being developed to counteract these diseases. For many doctors and researchers, the goal was to find the physical cause of the disease and then develop a cure to eradicate them. Gerry was a bit of a wanderer during the decade after he graduated in 1903. Initially, he focused on psychiatry and became the first pathologist and clinical director of the provincial asylum at 999 Queen Street. Even here, the focus was on the physical causes of disease. In 1905, the microorganism that causes syphilis was identified. In its final stages, syphilis causes severe mental disorder, and up to 25% of the patients in an asylum could be syphilitic. If so many patients were driven mad by one type of bacteria, why couldn't other forms of madness have similar causes? However, Gerry would quit after less than 24 months. His boss wasn't upset and told him there was no future in psychiatry for a man of your talents. Over the next 4 years, Gerry and his new wife Edna, heiress to an iron foundry fortune, would pinball around the Western world, teaching at U of T and Berkeley, while taking working vacations to visit the top medical research laboratories in Europe and North America. One of his most important trips was to New York, where the Department of Health had improved the potency of the diphtheria antitoxin while slashing its cost by 90% through the use of a production line. The antitoxin was distributed free of charge to the poor of New York, and the remainder was sold elsewhere to pay for production. The problem was that outside of New York, this antitoxin remained a luxury and only available to the rich.
In 1913, Gerry returned to Toronto to become professor of hygiene at U of T and to assist in the production of Canada's first rabies vaccine. After this success, Gerry made his pitch to the university. If they can manufacture diphtheria antitoxin in New York, why can't we do it here? And more. The Board of Governors needed time to think, but Gerry was impatient. One of his colleagues offered to let him use an empty lot next to his home near Bathurst and Bloor. Edna's father had died in 1912, and a chunk of her inheritance was used to build and equip a 2-story barn and stable made of corrugated metal. Why did they need a stable?
The idea was that horses are immune to diphtheria. And one drop of diphtheria is lethal, murderously so. I mean, one drop could kill 30,000 guinea pigs. So when you're handling this stuff, you have to talk about rubber gloves. I mean, you have to be really careful. And you could have killed him if he was exposed to it. And but the idea was you would take the diphtheria toxin, this really lethal germ, and you would and put it. They would cut a hole in the vein of a horse's neck, and insert a rubber hose, and they would put the toxin into the horse's bloodstream, and then extract the horse's blood, which immunizes the blood, and then that blood is injected into humans, the children, and that immunizes them against diphtheria. And so that was that technology that already existed in Europe, but what my grandfather did was take it to the next level. And Canadians, for a lot of complex reasons, were the first in the world to eradicate diphtheria.
Just to be clear, this process did not harm the horses. As James said, they're immune to diphtheria, and the horses that Gerry purchased would have otherwise gone to the glue factory. Gerry got his wife and his sister to act as lab assistants to process the antitoxin. And in March 1914, he sold his first batch to Ontario's Board of Health at 1/5 of the commercial price. Pretty soon, orders were pouring in from across the country. We should add that Gerry's barn has actually been preserved and can be found near Steeles and Dufferin. Flush with success, Gerry presented his vision to the U of T Board of Governors.
The idea that was so powerful was that the University of Toronto was going to manufacture this, not a commercial drug company. And that this is going to be done as a public service. So I'm going to make better quality stuff than the Americans, the Europeans. And the cost is going to be cheaper than that. That's going to be done as a public service through the university, which is a mandate of the university. And it will be a self-sustaining, non-profit organization that will sustain itself.
The board approved his proposal, and in 1914, the antitoxin laboratories opened in the basement of the School of Hygiene.
Within a year, Gerry's project would be boosted by the start of World War I. Traditionally, more soldiers died from infection and disease than in battle, and this was true at the start of the Great War. In fact, 5% of all deaths at the front were being caused by wounds infected by tetanus. Gerry created a plan to mass-produce tetanus shots for 65 cents each. This price was so low that the British War Office asked for confirmation. U of T didn't have the money to pay for the necessary infrastructure, so the president reached out to Albert Gooderham, managing director of the Gooderham and Worts, the massive distillery from which the distillery district gets its name, and he agreed to provide $75,000 to the purchase an abandoned farm by Steeles and Dufferin, as well as the necessary buildings, animals, and lab equipment. His only condition was that the lab should be named after his friend, Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught and former Governor General. As such, it was called Connaught Labs. In less than a year, the farm began producing vast quantities of medicines at a fraction of the commercial price. Some of these products went overseas for use in the war. Others stayed in Canada as provinces began to provide the free distribution of drugs for diphtheria, typhoid, rabies, tetanus, smallpox, and meningitis. While this was happening, Gerry was also training soldiers in proper hygiene, like purifying water, ventilating barracks, and burning garbage. He also led information campaigns against VD in the Canadian Army, a topic that, as you can guess, military brass had previously preferred to ignore. He would spend the last 6 months of the war overseas, leading a mobile laboratory for the Royal Army Medical Corps, responsible for analyzing and identifying threats to the health of the soldiers outside of the gas, bullets, and bombs being fired by the enemy, of course. While his unit was deployed behind the lines, he would have been all too familiar with the carnage at the front.
Upon his return to U of T after the war, Gerry overhauled the public health program within his department. He extended the program by an extra year, mandated mandatory observational visits to local clinics, and added a 3-week summer extension for students to inspect schools, restaurants, water filtration plants, and other sites. By 1920, every province was distributing Connaught products to the public free of charge.
His great contribution was making this universally available to the poor, because it was the poor who were dying. If you were in Canada in 1910, if your child got diphtheria, they would probably die, or had a very good chance of dying, because they didn't have the money. It was just as straight as that. So very expensive imported vaccines from the States or Europe. And so he said, "What? We got to make this and make it high quality, but also giving it free to the poor and everybody." So this was a radical idea then. This is way before Tommy Douglas, right? The idea of coordinating it nationally, and that so boards of health would distribute these products free. And so he's making them at cost, and so he's and giving them away. So he's undercutting the commercial competition, and so they were not happy. And the other aspect that made it unique was it set at a university. Like when he pitched the university, he said, "You're going to own this and run this, and it's going to integrate research, teaching, and the manufacturing of biomedical products, uniting all that." That was unprecedented in the world. Everywhere else in Europe and the States was all broken up into different departments. And that was his sort of, synthetic idea that was unique. And they backed him. And then he was only in his 20s. And as it turns out, historically, this was the genius of it, that it was not only undercutting price, but it was the best quality medicine as well.
For all these accomplishments, another event would supercharge the growth of Connaught Labs and turn Gerry into a world leader in public health. This was the discovery of insulin by a team led by Frederick Banting. Gerry wasn't involved in the research or lab work, but he was responsible for maintaining peace between the fractious team members. In one case, he got all of them to sign a contract pledging not to register an insulin patent with a commercial firm. In another case, he had to intercept an enraged Banting as he went to confront J.J.R. MacLeod, with whom he was sharing the Nobel Prize, when Banting believed that Charles Best had deserved that honor. Until then, diabetes had usually been a fatal disease. Suddenly, it was treatable. And Gerry had to figure out how to mass-produce a product that had only recently been discovered. It would be more than a year until Connaught could produce enough insulin to meet demand within Canada, and Gerry was forced to admit that Connaught couldn't handle the global demand alone. He would sign deals with Eli Lilly and other drug companies, licensing them to produce insulin for sale in exchange for royalties that could be used to fund future research.
Best would later famously say there would be no insulin without FitzGerald, because he was the key player in keeping it all together. And by the way, all the profits of insulin go back into research at the lab. There's no personal profit to be made.
By 1923, Gerry's success had caught the attention of the Rockefeller Foundation.
He donated $1.2 million to my grandfather, which I guess would be about $50 million now, I guess. And they built what was called then the University of School of Hygiene at college and university.
The new School of Hygiene would open in 1927. It was linked to Connaught Labs and used the lab's resources to pay for education and research. Some of the Rockefellers' money would also be used to build the FitzGerald building at 150 College Street, which included a bust of Gerry that was placed in the school library. All of these projects reflected Gerry's philosophy when it came to public health.
He thought globally and holistically, so the idea of nutrition and exercise and diet and vaccination. He had studied at the Pasteur Institute in France, and so he was really interested in preventive medicine. And I think this stemmed from his own personal story growing up in a small town in Harriston, Ontario, just a town of a couple of thousand. His pharmacist father in a village drugstore was making pills by hand, and meanwhile he had his mother was an invalid who died at 50. And my grandfather was an apprentice in this drugstore, helping his father with the drugs, but sort of seeing how ineffectual they were in the 1890s. This was not getting anywhere. It was sort of curative medicine. Take this pill and you'll be better, rather than let's prevent these diseases from starting in the first place. Let's fireproof the house before we call the firemen, and that way of thinking.
In 1924, Connaught arrived with another breakthrough when it prepared the first diphtheria toxoid in North America. Unlike the antitoxin, the toxoid acted like a vaccine and provided ongoing immunity. Gerry followed up on this accomplishment with mass immunization campaigns. A later study would find that a 90% drop in diphtheria cases among immunized populations. By this time, Connaught was producing treatments for 16 different diseases and shipping them to 19 different countries. Maclean's described it as a perfectly functioning peacetime munitions plant where science fashions its weapon of war against disease.
Pharmacology would probably be a more popular subject if people described it like that. Gerry was a study in contrasts. On the surface, he was calm and courteous, gently giving direction by means of suggestion. But under the surface, he was a fireball of energy. Play to win or don't play at all, he urged. He was also very high-strung and found noise intolerable. Staff were instructed to always wear rubber-soled shoes because the click of shoes on the hardwood floor would drive him to distraction. There was no question that his personal life was secondary to his work.
I think, you see, because he was so driven, he was fixed on this idea. At one point later after his death, his wife said to a journalist, "I didn't marry a man, I married an idea." And it was this public health idea, this unique idea that I just explained. And it's very difficult to reduce to a meme. It is a complex idea, but it worked. And so his workaholism, if we want to call it that, his dedication, the more his career grew, he was attracting more and more people. We want you to be dean of medicine. We want you to work for the League of Nations internationally. It's amazing the duties that he took. So needless to say, he had no time for parenting. Like his children, Jack, my father, and Molly, growing up in the house that I grew up in, were packed off to boarding school very young. My father to Upper Connaught College when he was 9, 3 blocks from the school. So I know that my father, that kind of shut my father down emotionally. He was a very bright man, just like my grandfather. But then there was an implicit pressure that he'd go into medicine as well. And my aunt, Molly, she was sent off to Haverhill, same age. And so I didn't figure this out until much later, but I thought we were neglected, but that generation it was even worse. And both of them were charming Irish, redheaded, witty people, and at a party, very charming. But they were addicts. My aunt became a severe alcoholic and ended up in Homewood Sanitarium, and my father, being a doctor, could prescribe himself any drug he wanted. So I didn't know this growing up, but he was quietly taking all kinds of powerful narcotics, but was kind of like a rock star, feeling his achievement, you see, because he was driven like my father, right? And so my grandparents were globetrotting by the 30s. They were going all over the world, and really didn't see my father and my aunt as children very often at all. And when I interviewed I met a woman who knew my parents in the 30s. She just died in her 90s, and she knew my grandparents. And she was very blunt. And she said, "Oh, your grandfather, brilliant." But he says, they were terrible parents.
Gerry would only be indirectly affected by the Wall Street crash and the onset of the Great Depression. Connaught was forced to cut back on salaries and expenditures, but Gerry was still thriving professionally. And in 1932, he became Dean of Medicine at U of T. A British scientist wrote, and I'm not even going to attempt a British accent here because I have too much respect for my listeners, "I was naturally taken aback at the demonstration that a nation generally considered to consist of backwoodsmen or prairie farmers has, so to speak, stolen a march on us and succeeded in doing something that we had not even seriously considered. I did not know it then, but I was soon to find out why. Canada had FitzGerald, we had not."
I mean, his collapse came fairly quickly. His career sort of peaked in the mid-30s when he was Dean of Medicine. Then he was sent on a world tour by the Rockefeller Foundation and the League of Nations, and he traveled to 25 countries, and he was exporting the Canadian model, which was considered the gold standard at the time, because people were still dying of diphtheria in the States and Canada. And we discovered insulin, it was a major breakthrough. So we had this reputation, Toronto, as this world leader. And so he spent a year on the road, going to all these universities and medical centers, lecturing them on the Connaught model. And there's a picture of him when he comes back, and he looks like he's aged 20 years. He was 55, going on 75. His hair's suddenly all gray. And then in my reports that I found, his medical reports, I found that he was suffering from a bleeding duodenal ulcer, migraines, insomnia. The stress was the crush of this, the midlife crisis kind of thing. And I think he was a very competitive guy and wanted to keep up to the young men and keep up that level of energy. And it was clear that he couldn't. And so he had a kind of physical break. He had to be hospitalized for the ulcer first. And that, I think, my theory is that sort of kicked in his depression. I can't do this anymore.
As James mentioned, colleagues were shocked by Gerry's appearance when he returned from his world tour. He was suffering from migraines and insomnia. Like many people his age, he seems to have been unwilling to acknowledge that he couldn't do as much as he was used to, and his inability to work upon his return to Toronto left him depressed. After escorting the Governor General on a tour of Connaught Farm in November 1938, he suffered a breakdown, losing control and sobbing inconsolably in his office. He was taken to the private patients' pavilion at Toronto General Hospital. One colleague wrote that he had gone off the deep end.
Thus far, we haven't said much about Gerry's siblings, but their lives have important parallels with his.
In my research, I discovered that I found the home they grew up in Harriston, and was able to get psychiatric files. As next of kin, I was entitled to my grandfather's and father's files. So there was information in there that I would have gotten. And so I learned about my great-grandfather, the pharmacist, and my great-grandmother, Alice, the invalid, and that my father had 3 siblings. His 2 brothers, Sidney and Bill, one was a banker, one was a lawyer, but they were kind of alienated bachelors, never married, and they were quite depressed. They were a different character. I wouldn't characterize Gerry as depressed during his career. He was what they would call, if you had to put a technical term on it, hypomanic. He was like unbelievable forward energy, like relentlessly. And they would say the energy was just astonishing. So there was no depression here. It was just, he was on the job. And an idealist and a pragmatist in getting it done, whereas his brothers, I gather, were much more melancholic. And I had to dig for the records because there was a silence around Sidney, particularly the lawyer. And then I discovered that he died. He killed himself right after my grandfather, jumping off the Cedar Vale Bridge, St. Clair and Bathurst. And so that was another family secret. So I was unraveling all of these dark secrets.
Gerry was released from the hospital before Christmas, and for the next couple of months, he spent most of his time at Connaught Farms talking to his colleagues about self-destructive thoughts. However, in February, he tried to kill himself by overdosing on a sedative called Nembutal. Upon waking up, he told a nurse, "I'm sorry to be such a burden to you all. Next time, I'll do it right." In response, he was confined to a psychiatric hospital near Hartford. This was no ordinary hospital. It was a luxurious private facility for old money elites of New England. However, it was still a psychiatric hospital, and Gerry was confined there involuntarily.
There he was there for 11 months, and by an astonishing coincidence, when I was starting my book, the first place I went to was the CAMH archives, because I knew he'd been a psychiatrist, and that maybe they have something in the file. And by cosmic coincidence, the week I walked in there, the archivist put a folder in my lap, and by coincidence, 60 confessional letters that my grandfather wrote at the end of his life from Hartford had been donated to the archives by the widow of the psychiatrist. The letters are addressed to Dr. Ferrer back in Toronto. And And it was just, they had just been donated. They've been sitting on a shelf for 45 years. Another scholar might have got them first if I hadn't gone in there. So it was sort of cosmic timing. And these letters, when I read these letters, I realized now I had a book because there was so much mystery. See, I hadn't cracked the mystery of the suicide. I had no sense of his inner life. He left very few personal letters. It's all just medical stuff. And all of a sudden I'm reading these anguished letters pouring out his heart to Ferrer and get me out of here. But they're very heartfelt. They're very alive with feeling.
One phrase continually appears in these letters.
I have committed an unpardonable sin, and the penalty is death. And he keeps repeating this. And so he's being punished by this. It's like it's a need to be punished, where he's feeling some kind of guilt. There's some profound guilt that he's feeling. It's very clear in the letters, but we don't know what this is. And I think that's the tragedy of the story. And this is how my own interpretation of these events was that was part of the hell that he was in, that he was being a victim of these incredibly invasive treatments, but no one was actually talking to him, about his life or his past. And he wasn't inclined that way anyways. That was his kind of Achilles heel, I think, as a man, and my father too. They weren't self-reflective people. They wouldn't sit and talk like this. They were very pragmatic people, and you just get on with it.
Gerry would be released after 9 months. Upon his return to Toronto, Gerry tried to throw himself back into work. World War II had begun, and Connaught was already playing a major role in producing medicines for the war effort. Gerry continued to pour out his heart to his colleagues. The wife of a friend said, "I don't have 3 children, I have 4. He's a sick man." This raises the questions of why he was released.
I think he figured it out. If I just pretend, as you say, act or pretend that I'm okay, I'll get out. He was desperate to get out. And so they say that in the letters. They say, well, we'll take a chance. Maybe he's still wobbly, but we'll let him out.
On Father's Day 1940, he made a second suicide attempt by taking Nembutal again. His son, James's father, discovered him and called for an ambulance that took him to Toronto General Hospital. He would die 4 days later. The death certificate says that he died of a bleeding ulcer. James would only learn about the truth of what happened after much investigation.
And I looked at his death certificate, and it was a cover-up. It said the duodenal ulcer. It was a whitewash, and I always. And also Nembutal overdose. You don't die from a Nembutal overdose, because he made an attempt, and on June 16th, 1940, they take him to TGH, and he died 4 days later on June 20th. So I kind of smelled a rat there too, with this 4-day gap, right? So I always sort of was circling around that one for years. What really happened on June 20th when he was on suicide watch in Toronto General Hospital? And then by cosmic luck, I found a doctor out on the West Coast in his 80s, a former dean of medicine, who knew the attending physician. And this was sort of my greatest breakthrough, and I went to him in an old folks' home, and he didn't want to tell me. I just asked him, "I know you know my grandfather, you were a young doctor, and I've heard all kinds of things about his suicide. People were telling me he jumped off the School of Hygiene," or people make things up when they don't know the truth. So there was lots of gossip and rumor. And he sent me away the first time. He wouldn't tell me. He was pained by it. He loved Dr. FitzGerald. And I went back, and I finally ran. I sort of confronted him. I said, "I'm the grandson, and I'm entitled to know. I need to know. There's something here that's very powerful." And so he did tell me. And what he said happened was, my grandfather was lying in the bed at the bell wing of, actually it was called the Private Patients Pavilion. It was a private part of the hospital. And that a nurse brought in this dinner, and he smuggled the dinner knife off of this dinner tray. And so just one of those knives with a little serrated tip, And in this gruesome way, he stabbed the femoral artery in his left thigh, because he knew that would kill him, that he could bleed to death within 5 minutes. And that's what happened. And so this was, as you can imagine, in 1940 Toronto, and this is a famous man, dean of medicine, founder of the Connaught Labs. So it was very quickly covered up and denied. It makes sense to me now. But when Dr. Hamilton, this doctor, told me this, I remember this wave of gratitude. I felt liberated. I felt like, thank you. Like, I've been dreaming about this, thinking about this, wondering about this, and it's like the truth will set you free is what I felt, And that we have to confront the stigma of suicide in this society. We have to tell the truth.
Gerry's children didn't learn the details of their father's death. Both of them were told that he had died of the Nembutal overdose. One imagines that they probably had some doubts, but if so, they didn't talk about them.
The funeral was 1940 at Convocation Hall at U of T, and Banting and Best were pallbearers, but the war was starting, and sort of there was a kind of disappearance of everybody's racing off to war, and he's kind of forgotten, in understandable at the time.
At his request, Gerry's body was cremated, and the ashes were placed in his bust at the library of the School of Hygiene. After his wife died 18 years later, his son would inter their remains together at Mount Pleasant Cemetery, where they remain to this day. In the 30 years after Gerry's death, Connaught Labs would produce billions of doses of medicine. As a newspaper wrote, throughout Canada and the world, thousands of people owe their lives to the laboratories who may not know that they even exist. However, by the 70s, U of T was worried about legal liabilities in the wake of the thalidomide scandal, in which a drug used to treat morning sickness was found to cause birth defects. As a result, the university decided to sell Connaught. Today, what's left of the labs is owned by a Swiss drug company called Sanofi Pasteur.
But we lost our global advantage. That was the problem, that Canada was renowned for high-quality vaccines that we would export to other countries. We were a net exporter to other countries. And then when COVID came, it exposed how it had to be completely reversed, and we're dependent on other countries. We're set back to 1910, when my grandfather started, that we were dependent on other countries, you see. And that this is the great irony, that Canadians don't realize that we actually led the world in this, and we let it slip for all kinds of reasons. So that's the other irony at work here. But there's signs of this coming back. There was a new school of public health was established at U of T in 2008, though it's not linked to Sanofi and it's not public service, so it's not the same model that my grandfather started.
Today, what's left of the labs is owned by a Swiss drug company called Sanofi Pasteur. There are lots of lessons that can be drawn from Gerry's life and work, and James' book, What Disturbs Our Blood, makes a number of arguments about Canadian healthcare and how we should address mental illness. However, I want to focus on something a bit more positive. I had never heard of Gerry FitzGerald before I started work on this episode, and I'm guessing that's true of most of you listening to it. But it's not an exaggeration to say that millions of people are alive today because of his work. There's a famous epitaph to the man who built St. Paul's Cathedral in London and was buried there. If you seek his monument, look around. Gerry's monument is the lives that he saved and their descendants who live today. It's not a bad legacy to leave behind.
Hey guys, that's it for this episode. If you like this episode, please reach out and give us 5 stars and leave us a review. It's how people find out about the podcast. And if you want to reach us, we are on all of the social media platforms. You could find us Muddy York Podcast, all one word, 2 Ys. You could find us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Check us out there. If you want to shoot us an email, that's muddy_york@outlook.com or muddyyorkpodcast@gmail.com. Reach out. We'd love to hear from you. We've been getting some great messages, and thank you. We love our fans. Thanks, guys.